Welcome to the reincarnation of the Kakophonos podcast. I'm Ricky Lacoste. It is April the 8th, 2010. In the background, you're hearing a piece by Thoth Ganesh, who we will be talking with a little later in the show, appropriately entitled Together Again. On this day, in 1904, Aleister Crowley first heard a voice talking to him and calling itself Aiwass, who claimed to be a messenger from the god Hur-Par-Krat, meaning Horus, as the child of Isis and Osiris. Crowley channeled and wrote down everything the voice told him over the course of the next 3 days, and subsequently titled it Liber al Vel Legis, or the Book of the Law. The god's commands explained that a new aeon for mankind had begun. As a supreme moral law, it declared, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," and that people should learn to live in tune with their true will. Well, it's certainly a new aeon for Kakophonos Internet Radio. Before we get on with the episode, here's a little history about the show. First, from one of its founders, Rod McPherson.
It was originally started in 2002 as a Winamp streaming MP3 radio station for pagan music and talk. It went into a 3-year hiatus, and now the phoenix has risen again.
And now the phoenix has risen yet again. In 2001, the pan-esoteric organization called Psychopomp, which we created for the purpose of spreading magical education, toyed with the idea of creating an online radio show. There were fine examples under other genres already on the internet using various mediums. Then around 2005 or 2006, Apple Incorporated's iPods and iTunes became hot and provided a medium and a forum that we'd been waiting for. Rod McPherson and myself launched the Kakophonos podcast for the first time. It was originally conceived as a Psychopomp production, but really Psychopomp was no more as a creative endeavor by that time. Perhaps it will be resurrected sometime in the future. We published a few Kakophonos episodes in 2006-2007 and had fun doing it, and gathered a cult following towards whom we were most grateful before closing up shop for various practical and personal reasons. My feeling today, looking back, is that although we deemed the subject matter quite broad within the pan-esoteric genre, the genre itself was a bit narrow and exclusive for the general listener, in my opinion. We dealt with all things pagan, magical, and mythological, etc. We want to broaden the topical spectrum into other arenas. This reminds me of the Ars Magica open stage that I ran early in the decade in Toronto. It was the city's only occult-themed open stage monthly event. Unfortunately, and perhaps inevitably, the various criticisms we received from one group was that it was too pagan. Another group complained that it was too ceremonial. None of this was true, of course, or rather that both statements were simultaneously true, and said more about the perspective, the resistance, and the agenda of the individual complainers than it did the reality and the aim of the event. That of cross-exposure of subject matter for the audience that would normally be passed over or ignored, and possibly a cross-pollination of knowledge. Ars Magica actually became ever more broad in its monthly topics and speakers and spontaneous guests as we went along. We wound up delving deeper into pagan traditions and high magic, of course, but we also explored the paranormal, tantra yoga, feng shui and geomancy, various forms of divination, cryptozoology, ufology, astrology, astrophysics, psychedelia, holy Kabbalah, gematria and numerology, meditation, dreams, Reiki, prophecy, altered consciousness through sacred drugs, sex magic, and many other topics too numerous to list here. Too pagan indeed. Well, I think we will do the same here and broaden our horizons to include these subjects and many more in our new incarnation of the Kakophonos podcast. Really, if you think about it, most, if not all, of these subjects are, arguably, applications and studies into the dynamics of consciousness itself. Any of these aforementioned subjects beg the old and legitimate cliches about the meaning of life, who we are, and why we're here. Kakophonos does not propose to answer these questions definitively, but to join you in exploring them together. I will be gathering material from you, my community, my friends, and my colleagues, So please feel free to contact me by phone if you know it. Text, email, Facebook, and especially Skype. Although not absolutely imperative, Skype seems to be the most efficient and inexpensive method with which to conduct and record an audio interview. It is small and almost stressless to download and install, and it's free. All you need is a microphone. But there are other solutions, and we'll cross that bridge later when we have to. In the meanwhile, we would very much appreciate some initial feedback and suggestions from you. We won't be able to do this without you. For starters, I will be facilitating an event at both Wiccanfest and Kaleidoscope festivals this summer. I thought this idea would be a lot of ghastly fun. It will be a nighttime campfire storytelling event. There will certainly be tales that will make your skin crawl. But all I ask is that these stories be true, as far as you know, of course. In the same vein, I would like to begin collecting true stories of the bizarre, the uncanny, and the wondrous from you as well. And I will be asking to interview you for the podcast. Any other subjects you'd like to introduce or talk about on Kakophonos, or if you have any great ideas or suggestions for material, or even if you'd like to participate in the creation of the podcast in any way, please contact me. In the meanwhile, sit back and enjoy this reincarnation of the Kakophonos podcast. I hope you enjoy it. And now, a word from our sponsors.
Hey, Sissy man.
What?
Stop frolicking in Daisyland drinking scheisse beer like this.
But it's only ginger ale.
Bah,
Hey.
all the ales are mouse pea compared to Vril Stein brew, the Uberman beer of the North.
I really don't want to.
Try it. We're doing a commercial.
No, thanks.
Come on, drink it.
I don't drink.
Drink it.
Listen, I'm just waiting here for...
Drink it, Scheiße, drink it. Vril Stein brew. Valhalla's beer, whether you drink it willfully or not.
Stein, Vril Stein, das ist los und das ist rein. Vril Stein, Bro.
Yeah, good, yeah.
Well, that was me, the ginger ale drinker, and I'm happy to announce that, one fat lip later, of course, I'm still a complete teetotaler. After that exciting encounter with Wolfgang Strudelberger, the official spokes-Viking of Vril Stein Brew, and an Asatru Gothi of the Frigg Orf Garth. But that's all water under the bridge. As a matter of fact, we've become friends since then, and Wolfgang will be back in later episodes of Kakophonos, wearing different hats. And speaking of hats, he wanted me to tell you that Vikings never actually wore horned helmets, and that Wolf does only because they are awesome. And finally, since we are a podcast, we also like listening to other podcasts. We would like to refer you to the ones we particularly enjoy. If you are a podcast, don't be shy and send us a promotional soundbite for your show so people can go and listen to it once they're done with ours. We would love to share our own with you on your show, if you'll have us. That being said, we would like to draw your attention to a fantastic podcast created by friends of ours called The Standing Stone and Garden Gate, the podcast for thinking pagans and working witches. They can be found at stonegatepodshow.net. That's stonegatepodshow.net. That was the Standing Stone and Garden Gate. Visit them online at stonegatepodshow.net. That's stonegatepodshow.net.
drumming is all anyone can hear. Well, music is a part of our religion, I just had to say. He just smiled and looked away. It's alright to worship how we feel. It's alright to feel the way we feel. It's alright to worship how we feel. It's alright to feel the way we feel. I get woken most Sunday mornings by a loud ringing bell. I don't complain, but I don't believe in their heaven and hell. It's alright to worship how we feel. It's alright to feel the way we feel. It's alright to worship how we feel. It's alright to feel the way we feel. It's alright to worship how we feel. It's alright to feel the way we feel. It's alright to worship how we feel. It's alright to feel the way we feel.
That was Thoth Ganesh and his song from his latest album of the same name, It's Our Right, as in R-I-T-E. Thoth Ganesh is a Toronto-born musician whose musical style has been called modern pagan, with influences in folk, rock, blues, and pagan music genres. His ability to rearrange known pagan songs and chants is a gift. He's a writer, composer, arranger, and producer, and has been playing music for over 30 years, to the delight of audiences young and old alike. He sings and plays guitar, and being a multi-instrumentalist, in the studio he also plays saxophone, bass, keyboards, mandolin, harmonica, drums, and penny whistle. Thoth Ganesh has performed many concerts including the Enchanted Mountain Goddess Conference, the Hamilton Pagan Pride Day, the Harvest Fest Festival, the Toronto Pagan Conference, Pagan Fest, the Brantford Pagan Meet and Greet, Wiccan Fest, and the Fire Dance Festival. Now, without further ado, here is Thoth Ganesh speaking with me on Kakophonos.
Hey, how are you, Ricky?
All right.
So how long have you been doing this podcast, Ricky?
Well, we've been doing it since 2002, to tell you the truth.
Oh, wow.
But we've had some long breaks and reincarnations, and this is actually the third incarnation.
Was it always called this?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Now is that based on chaos paradigm or thelema or?
No, actually, as a matter of fact, it's the original Greek word for terrible sounds.
Uh-oh, hang on a second. I changed my mind.
And that was our interview with Thoth Ganesh. No, just joking. Yeah. Yeah. It's the root words for cacophony. That's where we get the word cacophony.
Right.
So we thought it was an interesting kind of twist to the whole thing, right? Because what we're talking about essentially are things that a lot of people just don't want to listen to, you know.
Yeah.
This is subject matter from paganism to parapsychology and a lot of stuff that the normal people just don't really want to hear in their safe little bubbles. So we thought, yeah, let's call it Kakophonos, right?
That sounds appropriate.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about It's Our Right, the song that I like so much out of these three. it's all right. Time ain't changing my ways, and together again. Are all three of them pagan related?
I would have to say yes if you use the broad definition of pagan related. That's where you also get into the definition. Okay, what makes a pagan musician? Well, a musician who's actually a pagan, making original music, you could actually technically classify that pagan music. Pagan music does not necessarily have to be any kind of specific genre. It can be, a lot of people think it maybe has to sound Celtic or maybe world music, but it really, as long as the message of the music is of things of interest or of importance to pagans, then it could be classified pagan music. So yes, in the broad sense of the term, all the tunes could be certainly identified as such.
In your song "It's Our Right," the song that I like so much, tell me a little bit about what influenced you in writing that one.
Well, that's an interesting question, Ricky, because it was a result of some real life experiences going on in the pagan / drum communities that I am acquainted with and part of. And there were incidences that had occurred in which some people who maybe aren't very tolerant or don't like hand drum music, don't like drumming circles, were complaining and making enough of an issue of the proximity of drumming to their place of residence that they made an issue of it and actually impacted the drumming circles by either having the circles having to actually geographically move location or change time. So, and there was just more than one occurrence of this happening. There's two very well-known Ontario pagan festivals which were impacted by outsiders' thoughts of drum circles and the drumming and the music that's accompanied with it. And also, too, even a lot of the hand drum groups that are out there have been having problems with noise complaints from outsiders who maybe aren't very tolerant.
Right.
So this song was basically was inspired by those incidents, and basically trying to indicate that, we have just as much a right to worship our deities as you have a right to worship your gods. One of the lyrics that goes into example talking about how on Sunday morning many people get woken up by that loud church bell. Well, I don't buy into what they're doing, but they're impacting my life, so I'm being tolerant. Why not have them be tolerant of the hand drumming? It's really, it's making a point of tolerance and understanding as opposed to conflict.
Absolutely. As you might know, I'm drummer myself, and yeah, I've experienced some of that intolerance myself around in the festivals as well as around Toronto here in the drumming circles.
Yep.
Yeah, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it certainly does happen, unfortunately.
Time Ain't Changing My Ways. What's that one about?
Well, that's the lyrical content of that song is very much autobiographical. Basically, celebrating my choice in lifestyle and spirituality, and just putting it out there. It's kind of like my personal manifesto.
Yeah.
It's actually quite different from most of my stuff because it's got a very hard driving snare and bass drum beat going on.
It's more rocky.
Oh yes, very much. That is the most hard rocking song on the third CD, because it's like I said, it's got the driving drums and some searing electric guitar, and it just pumps. And I'm happy with the lyrical content. I think it works, and I really enjoy the song.
And then Together Again, this is what we're going to close off with. What's that one about?
That song, Ricky, was actually inspired by my self-realization of having lived past lives. And that realization came about through dreaming and some lucid dreaming and some meditation. And what had happened about 2 years ago is I actually met someone here now, in the here and now, I met somebody that I certainly know that I had known before in a previous life, and can even identify where it was. And so the lyrical content of that song is all about that realization of a past life and somebody who was very much involved with me.
Wow, you know what? I've got to pay more attention to this song now because people like us, Thoth, who keep our minds and hearts open towards the possibility of other lives, and who have experienced memories of other lives, of what we think are other lives, and our musicians all have a song like this in our hearts, that because I've got one as well. It's called Celtic Eyes, and
right on.
And you just pretty much described my piece as well.
There you go.
Yeah. Yes, and anybody who comes onto our website will, if they click on the image of the album cover, It's All Right, we'll go directly to http://cdbaby.com /all, and then /Thoth Ganesh, and that's in English, because it's an Egyptian name, Thoth, Thoth, and Ganesh, it's all one word. So cdbaby.com /all/Thoth Ganesh. Here's something I've always wanted to ask you about. Why don't you tell me what inspired you to call yourself Thoth Ganesh?
Sure, Rick. It was a matter of wanting to decide quite a few years ago on what some would refer to as a craft name, or some would refer to as a magical name. I actually took upon that AKA of Thoth Ganesh prior to going out into the pagan community as a musician, but I wanted to keep it because it's a name that most certainly has a lot of power for me, because it is a craft name too. The reason why I chose it was after study of many deities. I initially gravitated towards maybe about a half dozen to a dozen, and after studying them, both Thoth and Ganesh were the two deities that very, very much, not just from an intellectual level, but from an internal, you can't put your finger on what's causing this intuitive kind of feeling. They were the two boys that became my boys. They're, the one thing they both have in common is they are known as deities of communication, and communication certainly is very, very, very much right up there on my list of important things, because if you can't communicate, well, there's going to be some trouble afloat, right?
In my training, I've come to know Thoth and Ganesh as being very powerful and very well-known psychopomps. And what psychopomp is they stand at the doorway between places, and they also take you between the worlds. Both Thoth and Ganesh. Ganesh is the quintessential psychopomp. He is the doorway.
Yeah. In fact, I only because of syntax did I actually put Thoth before Ganesh, because in reality, the more realistic thing to do, or more appropriate thing to do, for lack of a better word, would have been to name myself Ganesh Thoth, because Ganesh is the one deity that all Hindus will go to first before they go to any other god, because he's known as the breaker of barriers. He breaks down obstacles. But having said that, he doesn't seem to mind that Thoth is the forename and he's the surname.
Very good. That's very good. Well, Thoth in the Greek and Roman pantheon is considered Hermes and Mercury.
Yes.
So they pretty much fill the same office, as far as I know, right?
Yes, most definitely. Yeah. And then of course Thoth too has the additional benefits of the god of writing, the god of books, the god of languages, so many things. I mean, both him and Ganesh in certain parts of the world at certain times were actually the quote-unquote god. There was no one above them, right?
Right.
Yep.
Thoth, I know, was the, if I have my mythology correct, he was the teacher of humanity. He he taught all humanity culture and words and song and all things artistic. I think it's a great name that you've got. I'm kind of envious. Anyway, what are you up to in the near future?
The very near future, I have the distinct honor of performing at Pagan Fest 2010 Beltane. It's going to be May 1st, May Saturday the 1st. I'm actually organizing and putting on the Saturday night concert, which will start at 7 and end around midnight. Headlining the show will be my Doors cover band called Morrison Hotel.
Right.
I'll be closing off the show with myself and a few musicians, and we'll be going as the Pagan Fest All-Star Band. I'll be bringing up some special players. I'm looking to get Kath Gillis to come up. Love to have you come up and play drums, too.
It's a possibility.
Yeah, no,
this
seriously.
This is in Barrie, Ontario?
Barrie, Ontario, yes. It's at Earth and Sky Connection, 461 Penetanguishene Road, just outside the city limits. It's 7 acres. It's a new age shop and 7 acres of a few outbuildings and a lot of land. And we've been having 4 times a year pagan festivals there for the last 2 years. This Beltane, upcoming Beltane, May 1st, is the 3rd year anniversary. And it's a really wonderful community. It's interesting, though, because the drum circles up there have more native hand drums than they do djembes.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. Very good.
So I'll be performing there in both Morrison Hotel as the lead singer and also as Thoth Ganesh doing a closing set of a few songs. We've got some very interesting other acts that are coming on board. It's going to be a real cool concert. In fact, I'm looking at a way to get it so that people can just come to the concert if they can't take in the whole festival, because I'm getting excited. There's some good talent lined up.
Very good.
I definitely, again, will be at Pagan Fest May 1st. In Barrie, Ontario. And I mean, there'll be a few fests here and there throughout the summertime that I certainly intend on getting to. Which ones, I'm not quite sure yet.
Very good. Well, listen, Todd, this was a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for talking to us all.
Well, likewise, Ricky, I really enjoyed this. Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure to be able to share with you some of my words.
Excellent.
All right, take it easy. Have a wonderful weekend, okay?
All right, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Presenting one night only on April the 8th, a night of music, magic, and mayhem. Esotericon, featuring an entire hour of the mind-numbing emissions of the Gaylord Slaughter Zen Buddhist Meditation Temple. Esotericon, bear witness to the spectacular laser show and dazzling pyrotechnics. The show will open up with another full hour of the outrageous vocal acrobatics of the Frick Off Garth, after true Vikings, all the way from Tokyo, Japan. Yes, Esotericon. Don't miss it, because if you do, then you're a great big son of a bitch. The evening will climax with much gnashing of teeth, with the brain-raping chants of the members of the Hare Krishna Shrine of Serenity from downtown New York. That's right, Esotericon. One night only, at the back of the old Beer Factory building on the other side of the burned-out Toyota. Don't let the condemned building sign fool you. Esotericon will be unleashed just inside. Just down the hall, past the second washroom, around the hole in the floor, and down the ladder, and just around the old boiler on the right. Esotericon! This is bullshit, guys. I quit.
On the line right now is Matthew Clooney. He's an upcoming author of his latest book, Paradigm Shifting, a guide to seeing and talking to spirits and ghosts. I'm going to have some questions for you about that, as well as the Fae. He lives with one foot in either side of two worlds, and it's sad to say his house is haunted. I don't know if that's such a sad thing, Matt.
Well, I don't know. After so many years of doing this, you know, you'd think you'd get better at telling them to stay at bay. But I mean, for those that don't actually know, a paradigm shift is simply a new way of viewing things. When you have the standard way that people look at ideas, often used in scientific circles, You have a strict way of looking at things. Somebody comes along with a brand new radical idea, and you have to encompass or embrace that idea. And by doing so, that's a paradigm shift. And I simply took that and I use it for what I do. Most people don't expect to have that conversation in an empty room and have somebody talk back. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, that's what I do.
Right.
It's been a lot of fun. It's been very illuminating as well.
Did you have? I mean, do you continue to experience to this day, or do you describe in your book the past, your past experiences?
This is ongoing. Okay, when I was 12 years old, saw my first ghost in a small town called Hessen. It's just outside of Listowel. If anybody wants to find that one on a map, that was my hometown. Anyway, Hessen had a lovely river that runs through it, and on the other side was an old abandoned shack, and there was a fellow there that had died. He was a drunk, and he drank himself to death. And I didn't know any of this. I was a kid, and so I went up there with a bunch of other kids, and there was like a picnic for a day, and my folks brought me up there with all these other people, and so I wandered up to the shack and saw this fellow. He walked by the window, and it was, like I say, it was the first time. It was an eye-opener. And from that point on, I mean, right up until, day before yesterday, there's folks in my home that are on a fairly consistent basis. They wander in and out. There are folks living in my backyard, that sort of thing. It's just an ongoing thing, and I don't expect that to end. But I will tell you this, never in how many years have I been doing this? Never once have I ever seen the gunshot wound.
Yeah.
That's for shock value, right?
Yeah, of course. It's symbolic, I think. This is what happened to the guy.
The people that I'm seeing, at least, I mean, this is, you got to remember too, everything that I talk about, whether it's in the book or like what we're doing now, anything that I'm talking about is seen through my own eyes, right? And everybody sees things slightly differently. But I've never once seen anybody with a gunshot wound or missing limbs or anything like that, because the way at least I see it is, look, if you're dead, you're not really going to want to picture yourself for the rest of that, with that gunshot wound wandering around.
That's right.
That's not how you see yourself.
And on top of that, I hear a lot of stories about ghosts in graveyards, and I mean, there are a lot of stories, and there's a lot of, I guess, in the parapsychological community, reputable sources that say, yeah, there are some haunted graveyards, and there's certain people who haunt the graveyards. Okay, and I'm sure that that's possible, but in my experience, I don't know if you have the same kind of experience. When you encounter these people are usually in the same places where they lived, not where they died. There's a theory that says that wherever a person has died violently, I know that this is a Japanese point of view as well. Wherever there's been a lot of emotion shed, where the ultimate sacrifice has been made, or the ultimate transition has been made, death, that's where the spirit stays. That's where the spirit lurks. And I'm not sure about that. I'm sure that's true, but for the most part, I think these people continue on where they've lived.
Well, I've seen, basically it comes down to three types of ghosts, right? I mean, to break it right down, you walk into a room and you get that feeling, oh, something's happened. All the hair stands up on your arms. So basically it's the creepy feeling. And you're right. When you walk into a room where somebody has died, or you're in the field where the body is buried, or what have you, right? The location where this has occurred, then it remembers. The house remembers, right? It soaks into the walls.
Place memory.
It's like yeah, exactly. It's like painting the walls black. Absolutely. And when you walk in, you absorb those emotions, and the room draws from you as well. And when you walk out, the room goes back to sleep.
What's the second kind of ghost?
Well, the second kind is the one-track recording. The example that I love to use is Abraham Lincoln. right? He gets shot in the Ford Theater, but nobody sees him in the Ford Theater. They see him at the White House.
Right.
Coolidge and his wife used to see him, and many people have actually reported a man standing in the White House, like in the Oval Office, with the tall smokestack hat that he wore.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a lot of folks that have been standing out on the lawn, looking in through the window and seeing him. So the thing is that if you actually and there's a hallway actually that you can stand in the White House where you can see him as he wanders by. Now, obviously, it's not like every day at clockwork, at 3 p.m. or anything. But if you're standing there, he'll walk right by you. He won't notice that you're there because it's just a recording. He's not there anymore, right? It's like throwing a tape of Mick Jagger into your tape recorder, right? And if you can track one down and throw that in there, it's from like 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And it's probably got a lot of tape hiss on it.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. You play it over and over and over again, and you're not ever going to really meet Mick Jagger. It's the same thing.
Right. So far, you're talking about one type in the way that I see it, and that the kind that's a recording, that's an impression, that's picked up by the observer, that has no consciousness. There's no consciousness involved, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep. And you got it. And then of course the spooky one, the one that really freaks people out,
is the one that you can communicate with.
Yes, when Abe Lincoln turns to you and says, "Hey man, you got the time?"
Yeah.
And the one that the most famous one that I love is the hitchhiker, right? The little girl hitchhiking, the 16-year-old, and the fellow picks her up.
Yes,
and
with the sweater.
Climbs into the back of the car.
Yeah, tell me the story from the beginning. Tell us the story.
Oh, sure. I mean, this is one that I was told when I was a kid in summer camp, right, to keep us in the beds at night. The little girl. Well, the guy is driving home one night. And, it's cold and it's dark and it's rainy, and he stops to pick a hitchhiking girl up. And she's probably, 15, 16 years old. And so she gives her name and her address, and she's in the back seat, and they start having a conversation, and he's driving. And then at some point he looks up, and she's not there anymore. She's gone. And he's justifiably concerned and freaked out. So he goes to the address that she's given him. And the mother and father answer the door, and they say, "Yeah, that's our daughter. She died 12 years ago."
Mm-hmm. And it happens from time to time. You're not the
Yes,
first one, that sort of thing.
absolutely.
Yeah, around this time
That's
of year.
right.
Yeah.
Invariably, people show up at my doorstep asking, who this poor girl is.
Yeah.
And, she's trying to come home. She's trying to make her way home. And every time, hopefully, she gets that little bit closer to making it to her parents' doorstep. At least that's what I hope.
Yeah. I've heard variations of that same story. It's considered one of the classic urban myths.
Yep.
Now, the term myth doesn't mean that it's complete fabrication. I mean, every myth is based on something. Wouldn't it be interesting if that something like that actually happened one way or another? And I'm sure that that something like that has. I mean, we hear about stuff like that all the time.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Who is in your house?
I've been trying to figure that out for about 2 years now.
Okay, how long have you been living there?
It was about 2 years ago that we actually bought the place.
Describe them.
We have a 2-bedroom. It's one of these semi-detached house. And we have a big backyard. It's about 143 feet long. There are folks living in our backyard. I'm pretty sure that they are the Fae. I've certainly dealt with the Fae in the past. We've had lots of experiences, and I've met a number of them. You hear stories about missing time, with the fairy folk.
Right.
And I'm one of those lucky guys. I've experienced that as well. So yeah, there are some folks that were living in the backyard. So we have our bedroom. We have our little girl's bedroom right next to us, and we had put our little girl in the bedroom there. And one night, Karen walks in, and there's something in the bedroom with her. That was my look too. I was really impressed. Unfortunately, this something was leathery wings, beaked. It had clawed feet, and was hovering over her crib. And when Karen walked in, our daughter was white as a ghost.
Oh, God.
Not breathing. Not that Karen could tell. She had to shake her to get any sort of response. When I made it upstairs from down here in pretty much record time, this creature was in there, and I'm very protective of my family, for obvious reasons. Yeah. So basically, I forced it out. Set up the barrier, set up the walls, forced it out of the room, and we took our daughter into our bedroom. Rhiannon was 6 months at the time. About 6 months. Yeah, about 6 months at the time. So we brought her into our room, settled her down. She was just fading out, and I looked over, and this creature was standing in the hallway looking in. This is the point where I got really pissed off and forced it into. Well, you're familiar with the idea of taking the entity and simply forcing it into a space of your making and dealing with it. That's all I did.
Yeah, I've never done that myself with ceremonial magic. My greatest tools are banishings.
Similar, very, very similar. I'm hands-on. I get my hands dirty in a big way, and I simply forced him into the bathroom, tore him into little pieces, and sent him back to wherever he came from. A couple of months later, and it was all quiet for several months after that, and then we just had visitor after visitor after visitor coming into Rhiannon. Like, we had Rhiannon sleeping in our room for the longest time, and these entities just kept coming in through our closet. We have the portal in the closet that, for whatever reason, I'm unable to actually close down, and that ticks me off. When you open that door, right? When you become that light, right? When I started working with spirits and making a conscious decision to work with the dead and helping, even when I 5 years ago I closed that door. I said, you know what, I'm done. I have a family. I need to establish boundaries. It doesn't really matter, does it? Because they know that you're there. So they're still coming through, and that was the problem, is that the boundaries weren't being respected. So we had all these entities coming into the bedroom and, tapping Rhiannon and waking her up and making her cry and freaking her out because they wanted to get my attention for whatever reason.
But what have you been seeing? Is this one of the Fae?
Very possibly. There are so many different. It's like saying mankind.
Right.
I mean,
okay.
There's how many billions of us on the planet, and every single one of us, even as a race individually, you and I are completely different. We're both white, but we're completely different, right?
Right.
And so you can't paint us with the same paintbrush, and it's the same thing with the Fae. I've met all kinds.
What I really, really want to ask you, just on the same train of thought, is I want to bounce an idea off you and get your impressions about it. Sure. Since time immemorial, almost every culture in the world, if not every culture in the world, has experienced and talked about and passed on knowledge of what we know as the fairy folk. We've got elves, dwarves, we've got goblins, we've got the mischievous, both mischievous and very helpful, and they all seem to have a similar kind of feel to them. And throughout the ages, you have the same sorts of stories where people become enchanted. They walk into an area where they are, and they come back weeks later. Everybody had been looking for them, but only a few moments had passed. Now, these stories have always been told by people who that's their point of reference. The forests, the dark places where people seldom trod unless they had a weapon because there are dangerous animals in the forests, right?
Yes,
and it's
absolutely.
You know what I mean? So it's the dark places, the underground passages, the caves, which are few and far between, but whenever you do find a significant cave, these are places of wonder, and these are the places where the dwarves are said to dwell, and the dark underground passages. Over the years, and over the millennia, the centuries, you wind up hearing the same stories. In my opinion, the same stories, but because of the point of reference of culture and technology, these stories seem to have transformed from mysterious forest dwelling and underground dwelling creatures, some of them dangerous, some of them helpful, some of them mischievous, to
you're seeing a lot of similarities, aren't you?
It's almost identical. If you take an objective view of the stories that have come to us from the deep past, and you listen to the stories that you hear from people, these people are baffled. They don't know what the hell's going on, but the mind winds up attaching, just through modern day points of reference, what they know, or what we think we know, and they describe their experiences using those references. Is it possible that, in your opinion, your experiences, what people say that are extraterrestrial experiences or extra dimensional experiences, if you think that they're all the same series of experiences?
My mom lives in Seaforth right now, and outside of Seaforth is a place called Bannockburn, and Bannockburn is a conservation area. And there's a lot of very interesting activity out there. Anybody who is in the area or is listening to your show, I highly recommend that they go up and just take a walk around. There is magic that is so untouched and so unplumbed that we forget here, because we live in our buildings, we live in our houses, and then we go out into those dark places and we forget just how old the world really is. And there are creatures and entities that have been there long before we ever were, and will be there long after we're gone. We went out, Karen and I, to Bannockburn, and I've been out a couple of times before that and had some very interesting and wonderful experiences, but I wanted to bring her out for an evening, so we went out during the day, and then we went back out at night, and we drove into the little roundabout. We got out, we had the flashlight. Karen was a little nervous about the whole adventure. And so, I was telling her some stories and stuff and sort of settling. And we heard off in the distance something that sounded like somebody trying to sound like an animal. And then silence, and then a little closer. I'm a bird! And it something like scuffling, but it's like, okay, here I am.
Right, okay.
Okay, here I am. Somebody making their way through the forest.
Okay.
Right? And getting closer, progressively. And so I noticed that, Karen had the flashlight, and she shone it down the trail, the pathway. And there was this mist that was coming down the pathway directly towards us. And I said, well, Karen, put the light out. You're shining it in their eyes. And so she turned the light off. And sure enough, this mist comes down the path and literally envelops us in the clearing. Now, the mist is not, again, if you're familiar with stories, the mist is simply the medium, right? It allows you to see through. It's the cotton that holds us from them. And if you're in that situation where you can break through that mist, then you can talk back and forth freely. So we had this mist show up, and we had a bunch of, I guess you could call them earth elementals. They stood maybe waist high, and there were a bunch of them gathered around that had come down through the pathway, and they felt very childlike, like you're telling stories to children. And I've often found that telling stories is a wonderful way of attracting that attention, because the stories are so different. They're stories about us, and we're very different than they are.
Right.
So we had all of these little ones gathered around, and then Karen was standing beside me, and she said, there's somebody here. And I had noticed somebody significantly taller walk across the field of view, and he was standing beside Karen. And I looked over, and there's this the analogy between what we used to know 1,000 years ago and the folks now in space, right? Aliens. You know what? It's pretty damn close, because what I saw, I guess I would term as gentry. The gentry were sort of the royalty of the Fae back in Ireland and Scotland. They weren't kings and queens, but they were ranked up there, and so the gentry was a term given to them, right? And this fellow, he was exceedingly tall and very thin. And he had the large eyes, and they were nictitating.
What's that? What does that mean?
Like a snake or a lizard,
Yeah.
where you've got the dual eyelid. He had the ears were a little longer, a little pointed, and his fingers. This was the interesting thing to me, is that his arms were long and thin, and his fingers, like as if they were dinner plates practically, and large hands, and the fingers that if you stretch the fingers out, you could reach the entire octave of the piano.
Right.
It's just right. When you spread the fingers out, they were unbelievable. So they're very long and very tapered, and he was very well dressed. But he also was staying beside my fiancée at the time, and the impression I got, because he ran his finger up her arm, down her arm, as if to, and he looked directly at me as if to say, "So, what do you want for her? She's interesting." And of course, me being me, went, well, okay, and I pushed, right? You form the barrier, you push everything out, the mist disappeared, the little ones, the earth elementals, scattered, and he still stood there. And it was at that point, yeah, he did. He looked at me and he smiled as if to say, "Yep, okay, now what?"
Karen experienced this as well?
Yes, she was right beside me. And that was at the point we said, we should probably get in the car now.
Oh, yeah, is this stuff going to be in your book?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. This conversation with Matt Clooney was so captivating that we are going to continue with the final half of this interview on the next episode of Kakophonos. We wish to thank Thoth Ganesh and Matthew Clooney from the bottom of our hearts for being on our show. And we wish to thank you, our listeners, for lending us your consciousness for this brief pebble of time. We hope it was worth your while. We'll hang out again soon enough. You've been listening to Kakophonos Internet Radio. This is Ricky Lacoste. Blessed be in 93. This episode was dedicated to Deo's shadow. We miss you.
Times then
Welcome to the reincarnation of the Kakophonos podcast. I'm Ricky Lacoste. It is April the 8th, 2010. In the background, you're hearing a piece by Thoth Ganesh, who we will be talking with a little later in the show, appropriately entitled Together Again. On this day, in 1904, Aleister Crowley first heard a voice talking to him and calling itself Aiwass, who claimed to be a messenger from the god Hur-Par-Krat, meaning Horus, as the child of Isis and Osiris. Crowley channeled and wrote down everything the voice told him over the course of the next 3 days, and subsequently titled it Liber al Vel Legis, or the Book of the Law. The god's commands explained that a new aeon for mankind had begun. As a supreme moral law, it declared, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," and that people should learn to live in tune with their true will. Well, it's certainly a new aeon for Kakophonos Internet Radio. Before we get on with the episode, here's a little history about the show. First, from one of its founders, Rod McPherson.
It was originally started in 2002 as a Winamp streaming MP3 radio station for pagan music and talk. It went into a 3-year hiatus, and now the phoenix has risen again.
And now the phoenix has risen yet again. In 2001, the pan-esoteric Orf Garth, but that's all water under the bridge. As a matter of fact, we've become friends since then, and Wolfgang will be back in later episodes of Kakophonos, wearing different hats. And speaking of hats, he wanted me to tell you that Vikings never actually wore horned helmets, and that Wolf does only because they are awesome. And finally, since we are a podcast, we also like listening to other podcasts. We would like to refer you to the ones we particularly enjoy. If you are a podcast, don't be shy and send us a promotional soundbite for your show so people can go and listen to it once they're done with ours. We would love to share our own with you on your show, if you'll have us. That being said, we would like to draw your attention to a fantastic podcast created by friends of ours called The Standing Stone and Garden Gate, the podcast for thinking pagans and working witches. They can be found at stonegatepodshow.net. That's stonegatepodshow.net. That was the Standing Stone and Garden Gate. Visit them online at stonegatepodshow.net. That's stonegatepodshow.net. Ghastly fun. It will be a nighttime campfire storytelling event. There will certainly be tales that will make your skin crawl. But all I ask is that these stories be true, as far as you know, of course. In the same vein, I would like to begin collecting true stories of the bizarre, the uncanny, and the wondrous from you as well. And I will be asking to interview you for the podcast. Any other subjects you'd like to introduce or talk about on Kakophonos, or if you have any great ideas or suggestions for material, or even if you'd like to participate in the creation of the podcast in any way, please contact me. In the meanwhile, sit back and enjoy this reincarnation of the Kakophonos podcast. I hope you enjoy it. And now, a word from our sponsors.
Hey, Sissy man.
What?
Stop frolicking in Daisyland drinking scheisse beer like this.
But it's only ginger ale.
Bah,
Hey.
all the ales are mouse-pea compared to Vril Stein brew, the Uberman beer of the North.
I really don't want to.
Try it. We're doing a commercial.
No, thanks.
Come on, drink it.
I don't drink.
Drink it.
Listen, I'm just waiting here for...
Drink it, Scheiße, drink it! Vril Stein brew. Valhalla's beer, whether you drink it willfully or not.
Vril Stein, lass dich los und lass dich rein. Vril Stein, Bro.
Yeah, good, yeah.
Well, that was me, the ginger ale drinker, and I'm happy to announce that, one fat lip later, of course, I'm still a complete teetotaler. After that exciting encounter with Wolfgang Strudelberger, the official spokes-Viking of Vril Stein Brew, and an true Gothi of the Frigg organization called Psychopomp, which we created for the purpose of spreading magical education, toyed with the idea of creating an online radio show. There were fine examples under other genres already on the internet using various mediums. Then around 2005 or 2006, Apple Incorporated's iPods and iTunes became hot and provided a medium and a forum that we'd been waiting for. Rod McPherson and myself launched the Kakophonos podcast for the first time. It was originally conceived as a Psychopomp production, but really Psychopomp was no more as a creative endeavor by that time. Perhaps it will be resurrected sometime in the future. We published a few Kakophonos episodes in 2006-2007 and had fun doing it, and gathered a cult following towards whom we were most grateful before closing up shop for various practical and personal reasons. My feeling today, looking back, is that although we deemed the subject matter quite broad within the pan-esoteric genre, the genre itself was a bit narrow and exclusive for the general listener, in my opinion. We dealt with all things pagan, magical, and mythological, etc. We want to broaden the topical spectrum into other arenas. This reminds me of the Ars Magica open stage that I ran early in the decade in Toronto. It was the city's only occult-themed open stage monthly event. Unfortunately, and perhaps inevitably, the various criticisms we received from one group was that it was too pagan. Another group complained that it was too ceremonial. None of this was true, of course, or rather that both statements were simultaneously true, and said more about the perspective, the resistance, and the agenda of the individual complainers than it did the reality and the aim of the event. That of cross-exposure of subject matter for the audience that would normally be passed over or ignored, and possibly a cross-pollination of knowledge. Ars Magica actually became ever more broad in its monthly topics and speakers and spontaneous guests as we went along. We wound up delving deeper into pagan traditions and high magic, of course, but we also explored the paranormal, tantra yoga, feng shui and geomancy, various forms of divination, cryptozoology, ufology, astrology, astrophysics, psychedelia, holy Kabbalah, gematria and numerology, meditation, dreams, Reiki, prophecy, altered consciousness through sacred drugs, sex magic, and many other topics too numerous to list here. Too pagan indeed. Well, I think we will do the same here and broaden our horizons to include these subjects and many more in our new incarnation of the Kakophonos podcast. Really, if you think about it, most, if not all, of these subjects are, arguably, applications and studies into the dynamics of consciousness itself. Any of these aforementioned subjects beg the old and legitimate cliches about the meaning of life, who we are, and why we're here. Kakophonos does not propose to answer these questions definitively, but to join you in exploring them together. I will be gathering material from you, my community, my friends, and my colleagues. So please feel free to contact me by phone if you know it, text, email, Facebook, and especially Skype. Although not absolutely imperative, Skype seems to be the most efficient and inexpensive method with which to conduct and record an audio interview. It is small and almost stressless to download and install, and it's free. All you need is a microphone. But there are other solutions, and we'll cross that bridge later when we have to. In the meanwhile, we would very much appreciate some initial feedback and suggestions from you. We won't be able to do this without you. For starters, I will be facilitating an event at both Wiccanfest and Kaleidoscope festivals this summer. I thought this idea would be a lot of